Thanks for joining us, and welcome back to those who joined for our virtual viewing party. My name is Graham Strickert, and I'll be your host for this portion of our event. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan and a founding member here at the Global Institute for Water Security. My research has looked specifically at the impact of people and animals in the Saskatchewan River Delta, the largest freshwater delta in North America, and an area that's seen immense change following the developments of E.B. Campbell and Gardner dams on the South Saskatchewan River. So our conversation today will be informed by the themes explored in this award-winning Patagonia film documentary called Damnation. And in case you missed it, you can watch Damnation for free now in our virtual theater from now through June 17th as part of the Let's Talk About Water Film Festival. But before I introduce our panel today, I want to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. With many of you joining from around the world, I hope that you'll take a moment to acknowledge and pay respects to one another as well. Today I'm joined by two remarkable individuals working to further understand the impacts, complications, and controversy of hydropower dams. We have Sarah Cox, who is an award-winning author and journalist based in Victoria, British Columbia. She is the author of the 2018 book Breaching the Peace, which won a British Columbia Book Prize and was a finalist for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing and the George Riga Award for Social Awareness. Sarah's article and opinion pieces have appeared in a variety of British Columbia national and international news outlets, including Business Magazine, and her writing accolades include 2 Western Magazine Awards. We also have with us Jeff Duda, who is a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Western Fisheries Research Center in Seattle, Washington. He's been working for the U.S. Geological Survey for 23 years and explores the ecological effects of human activities and natural disturbance regimes on aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems and organisms. Jeff has led research teams to understand the ecological outcomes of the largest dam removal in U.S. history on the Elwha River. He was also the principal investigator synthesizing the effects of dam removal at the USGS John Wesley Powell Center for Analysis and Synthesis in Fort Collins, Colorado. So first, let me say thank you both so much for joining us for this discussion today. We're so happy that you could make it.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm happy to be here.
So maybe before we jump in, we could just do a quick hydropower dams 101. So what is a hydropower dam? Why are they so important? And why can they be so detrimental?
I could take the first crack at that one.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, hydropower dams have been around for a long time. They operate in a way that can harness the energy that is created by running water. The earliest kind of forms of this were things like mill dams to physically move a wheel. As technology developed over time, dams became larger, they became electrified, and a lot of dams that operate today for hydropower are connected to a grid, and they provide electricity to the grid. Dams in general, including hydropower dams, depending on how large they are, how they're operated, where they're located in the watershed, how many other dams might be present in that watershed, can really affect the ecology of the river. There's a couple of things that can happen. One is you change the natural flow regime of that river by operating a dam. They store and release water according to the needs of power generation, and very often that can make the hydrograph look quite different than what it would if the dam wasn't in place. Another thing that is typical of a dam is they can sequester sediment and nutrients and other materials that can be transported by a river. Basically, a good example of that is sediment. During times of high flows and peak flows, rivers can harvest a lot of sediment material and transport it downstream. And once it hits that standing water behind a dam, it loses the capacity to transport that material and it falls out. And over time, you have sequestration of that material behind the dam. And sedimentation is a significant issue for many dams. Another thing that dams can do, no matter their purpose or their size, is they can cut off connectivity for migratory organisms as they travel through the ecosystem. If there's no provision for any passage for organisms like fish, then they're pretty much limited in their ability to navigate through that river system.
Great, thanks so much. Sarah, did you want to have a response to that as well?
No, that was a fantastic summary. I will just kind of add from my perspective here in Canada, and I'm joining you today from Victoria on the territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. Large dams, we have an issue with methyl mercury contamination here of fish that work their way up the food chain and cause harm not just to wildlife, but also to people eating them, and disproportionately to Indigenous people who rely on fish and other country foods still very much for subsistence in far-flung places of Canada. And there's so many examples here in Canada of dams cutting off connectivity. One important species that it's cut off connectivity for, and again, that is closely related to the needs of Indigenous people, are for caribou. We've had most of our caribou here in Canada are now, most of the herds are now endangered. And in many instances, the downward spiral began with large dams cutting off migration routes. We also see that dams are disproportionately located in rich agricultural areas. We have that issue ongoing with one of the large dams under construction in Canada now, the Site C dam. So they flood in many instances rich agricultural land. This is land traditionally where people have settled. They sever cultural riverways, networks of transportation for Indigenous peoples, and they have a huge impact on species that are already vulnerable to extinction. And again, we have many examples of that here in Canada. The Site C dam, which of course is the dam I'm most familiar with, is going to destroy habitat for more than 100 species that are already at risk of extinction.
Wow. Thank you both for kicking us off with such a comprehensive response to what dams do and what impacts they can have. So the Dam Nation documentary that we watched earlier highlighted a number of dams that were located in the state of Washington, specifically along the Elwha River. Jeff, why is this river so popular? What makes it so popular, and why is it at the forefront of the conversation that we're having?
Yeah, the Elwha has been kind of the highlight of dam removal and the discussions around dam removal and a lot of the policies surrounding dam removal. It's been a project that's been in the works for decades. It started in the mid 1980s when the dams were up for relicensing by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That happens in dams in the U.S. You have to have a license in order for them to operate. That license needs to be renewed on a regular, every 30, 40 years. In the case of the Elwha dams, it was one of the dams never received a license because it was built before the enabling legislation for the Federal Power Act. And the other dam, the Glines Canyon Dam, actually occurred inside of a national park. And so once the proceedings began in earnest for the relicensing, and they were privately owned dams, once the application was put in place, a number of entities, including and especially the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, brought legal proceedings to have the dams consider the effects that they were having on fish, particularly salmon populations. And so that really kind of kicked off a long and healthy amount of debate and legal challenges. And so it was kind of, one of the first kind of big, large dam removal projects that were considered. The two dams are two of the four largest dams that have ever been removed in the United States. All 5 species of Pacific salmon were present in the watershed historically, and their populations were hanging on downstream of the dams, despite the fact that they were, a shell of their former themselves in terms of the size of the population and life history diversity. And in some cases, they were supported by fish hatchery production. Having one of the dams inside of a national park also was kind of a big issue because everything was protected. You know, if you were to remove the dam, significant amount of the watershed is protected as wilderness inside of Olympic National Park. And so all of these kind of factors really kind of coalesce to make the Elwha, you know, really well-known, notable project. I run into people who say, I learned about the Elwha back in graduate school, you know, and they were talking about it for a long time. And it was really just a big and important project. Then once the project, you know, got approval, it was basically an act of Congress, the 1992 Elwha River Fisheries and Ecosystem Restoration Act. That basically, you know, took that Federal Energy Regulatory Commission proceedings and basically came to a negotiated settlement among all the parties, the tribe, the private landowners, the National Park Service. And that law basically said to the Department of the Interior, the federal government of the United States, figure out the best way to accomplish the goals of this act. And so then a number of years of study occurred where they looked at all the various possible alternatives, building fish ladders, taking out one or the other of the dams, or removing both dams. And then it was determined after study that the best way to accomplish the goals set forth in the act was to remove both dams. And so once that happened, there was a lot of anticipation for a number of years, but a lot of stuff had to happen before we could get to the actual dam removal, which, you know, remarkable, striking footage that is featured prominently in the film Damnation. A lot of things had to happen prior to getting to the point of having the excavator on top of the, jackhammering away at the dam. Because there are elements of the Elwha Act that said you have to protect downstream property owners. You have to protect the water supply for the city of Port Angeles receives their drinking water from the river. There's industrial water users. And all of that required some significant mitigation to occur prior to getting to the jackhammers. And so that, you know, kind of was a drawn out, long process. And so during that time, there was just a lot of, you know, anticipation and a lot of people talking about the Elwha. And then, of course, once it started, you see this remarkable and dramatic footage that was featured in the film. The Park Service set up webcams, basically showing live views of the project, and it just received a lot of attention. And I think Linda, in her conversation earlier, basically was talking about how a lot of the documentary films and just a lot of the news stories that we hear about environmental type issues is really can be depressing, sad. It seems like a very kind of a lot of coverage is talking about the impacts that we're having on the environment, the dire kind of consequences. And the Elwha really represents hope for a lot of people. And it's one of those projects where you could have a significant action to hopefully, you know, fully restore an ecosystem. And so it really kind of represents a symbol that a lot of people are rally behind in terms of just what the possibilities are for dam removal.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff. Sarah, over to you now. I know there's 3 dams on the Peace River in British Columbia. Maybe you can shed some light on what's going on there.
Sure. And I was just going to say, in terms of the Elwha, we have heard of the Elwha, of course, here in Victoria. It's just across, just a short ferry ride away, about a 90-minute ferry ride and a short drive over to the Olympic Peninsula. And I've actually been there before it was decommissioned. And interestingly enough, we're not talking about dam removal here in Canada. In fact, I Googled it this morning because I was thinking, wow, do I even know of any dams that are being removed in Canada? And here we have about 15,000 dams in Canada. And of those, only just over 1,000 are large dams. And in fact, I did discover that there have been some small dam removals, but the conversation about dam removal is just not happening in Canada. And in fact, we are building large dams. The US is no longer building large dams, but we are. And we have some very expensive and very controversial large dams under construction right now. right across the country from Labrador on the east coast to northern Manitoba to northern BC. And so the three dams that you're talking about on BC's Peace River are in the northeast of the province. They're quite far away from where most of the population in BC is, and they're very much out of sight and out of mind for many people in BC, but not, of course, for the people who live there. So of those dams, the first, the WAC Bennett Dam, which is still one of the largest, I think it's the second largest or third largest dam in the country, was built in the late 1960s. It's just an absolutely mammoth dam with a mammoth reservoir. It's one of the largest reservoirs in the entire world. And it flooded an area of the north that's about 15 times the size of the city of Vancouver. And then in around 1980, a smaller dam on the Peace River opened. It's called the Peace Canyon Dam. And the plans had always been BC Hydro. So of course, it's a bit different here in Canada. We have crown corporations that are responsible for power. And in Canada, that is mostly, in this part of Canada anyway, mostly hydropower. And so we have BC Hydro. It's not BC Power, it's BC Hydro. And that's because almost all of our power here in BC comes from these large hydro dams. So just because BC Hydro builds dams, for decades, there had been plans to build a third dam on the Peace River, which was called the Site C Dam. And that is the dam that is currently under construction, that only proceeded after the government changed the law to remove the Watchdog Utilities Commission from determining whether the project was in the public interest. And this dam is also just over halfway through construction if everything goes according to plan, but everything is not going according to plan, which many people predicted. The dam is nowhere near the largest in Canada, and right now the price tag is $16 billion, almost sure to climb, making it the most expensive dam in Canadian history. The power will never be sold for a fraction of what it costs to produce. It will likely, most of it will likely be exported to the US for, again, a fraction of the cost of producing it. And the dam is also, I wouldn't say much in the news right now, but in the news on and off, because it is being built under very poor geotechnical conditions. And there's a problem because the foundation is weak. This is going to be the first L-shaped earthen dam in the world. And they're coming up with what sounds from a layperson's point of view as some pretty far-fetched schemes to anchor it. And successive governments have just decided to continue no matter the price tag and to try to surmount all of these geotechnical problems which were flagged right from the very beginning.
Wow. Well, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what happens even before the dam is built. So specifically the consultation process with local communities. That's one of the things that's really important to me. Based on your book, Sarah, the consultation process for new dams sets up a really big power dynamic, and it results in what you describe as a David and Goliath situation. So individual community members against, a province or even the federal government. Can you tell us about the process of consultation for the development of new dams?
Yes, so there was extensive consultation. There has to be, according to federal and provincial laws. And so in terms of crossing the T's and dotting the I's, there were many meetings, many letters with everybody affected, and in particular with Treaty 8 First Nations, on whose territory the dam is being built. And also with the people who live in the nearby community of Fort St. John and the farmers in the valley, some of them who have been there for many generations. But what is a matter of contention here is whether consultation means that accommodations need to be made. And what some First Nations have said again and again is that they were inundated with paperwork that they needed to respond to, and that it didn't matter what they suggested, that it seemed to them that the government and BC Hydro planned to go ahead with this project no matter what. And they did not feel that, even though there had been talks and letters and many elements of discussion, that they had been heard or that anything had been changed. And I just want to talk for a sec about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which BC has now enacted into law and is changing provincial legislation to bring it into line with the UN Declaration. So one primary plank in that declaration is the right of free, prior, and informed consent for large industrial projects. The dam did not have the free, prior, and informed consent of any Treaty 8 First Nation before it was approved. After it was approved, nations began signing economic benefit impact agreements. One deal was reached last year with Prophet River First Nation, which stated when they signed the economic impact benefit agreement that the project had not received their free, prior, and informed consent. Another Treaty 8 First Nation, West Moberly First Nations, has launched a treaty rights case, which will be heard in court starting next March. It will be a landmark treaty rights case, and their case alleges that the Site C Dam, along with the previous two dams on the Peace River, constitute an unjustifiable infringement of their treaty rights. And again, everybody's watching this case closely. It will be a landmark case, and we will just wait and see what happens with that.
I wonder if either of you have seen a case where there were fair negotiations before the development of a dam or even removal of a dam.
Yeah, I'm not as tuned into the dam construction side of the equation. I think a lot of dam removals, one of the hallmarks of them is really these public-private partnerships that emerge and develop, and really having those collaborative kind of approaches to solve problems surrounding dam removal is really important. Very often, a lot of these dams are either obsolete, they're no longer meeting their original purpose for which they were built. A lot of cases, safety can be an issue that's driving dam removal. And so, there's going to be a significant number of stakeholders that are often involved. And so it really is having these communications that are really important to really get to coming up with the best solution for dealing with a lot of these dams and these infrastructure issues that we're going to be faced with moving forward. It's very likely that a lot of the drivers that have been behind a lot of these dam removal projects are going to continue into the future. We had a heyday of dam building in the U.S. and North America, and a lot of those dams are aging, and there's going to be significant amounts of determining the trade-offs of what to do about these dams, whether they need to be rebuilt, rehabilitated, or in some cases removed. And I think that is starting to take hold, and it's largely because of a lot of the success that we've seen in other dam removals and dealing with some of these problematic dams that exist. And moving forward, I think that there's been some really positive developments in that vein. There was recently a joint statement that was released by the U.S. hydropower industry and a number of river conservation organizations, where they're kind of working on finding ways to maximize the benefits of dams while minimizing the the environmental consequences of them. And in that, they acknowledge that in some cases, if dams are unsafe or they're obsolete and no longer meeting their original purpose, that dam removal should be a viable option, something that we need to put in both political and kind of scientific frameworks in order to figure out how best to accomplish that. That's a huge step and something that's pretty significant. And that if you would have said 10, 15 years ago that would be the case, where you have this kind of a joint statement from groups that are typically, sitting on the other side of issues like that, coming together is pretty significant.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. I wonder if we could shift gears a little bit, and I'll play the devil's advocate, because this is an argument that we hear quite often, is how do we balance hydropower production with growing demand for electricity in the context of a changing climate? For example, if we remove hydropower dams, won't that lead to more greenhouse gas emissions?
A very interesting question. And so I think, again, speaking from a Canadian perspective, there are a number of issues underlying here. And one of them is that we seem to be building large dams in Canada now, more for exporting the power to the US than because we need the power in Canada. We're in an era where there's more energy efficiency. Very interestingly, and this is just one small example, as the Site C dam proceeded, BC Hydro slashed its energy conservation programs. And I think there are huge energy savings that can come with increased energy conservation. You've got to factor in the fact that we lose 10% of the energy generated by these dams when the electricity is transported large distances, very inefficient. The world seems to be moving more towards producing energy locally. There's this whole concept of prosumers, where people are energy producers as well as consumers. Storage, battery storage, and other storage such as pumped hydro storage are moving in new directions. We have many alternatives, and I don't think it's a question of one or the other. It's more like an ecosystem of energy options where you have different energy options that complement each other. We just have to figure out a way to do things differently and to tread a little lighter on planet Earth.
Jeff, did you also want to address that question? Or
I thought that was really well said. There's a significant amount of investment that's happening right now in trying to figure out ways to come up with creative solutions to the energy issues that Sarah mentioned in her answer. And it's one size fits all is not going to be a way to tackle this problem. I think that there's a significant amount of ways that we can get around some of the environmental impacts that we're having, as long as we continue to innovate. And then, as Sarah also mentioned, we all consume energy. We're using electricity right now. What can we do in our own lives to have minimize the impact and our use of energy? And I think that films like the one that was featured today and others, brings this to light to a lot of people. Just simply, I think, are unaware of how connected we all are to these issues. And so, hopefully it can move the needle, because we're definitely facing a lot of calls and plans and have targets in the future that we're trying to meet to decarbonize the grid. And it's going to really take a kind of multifaceted approach, I think, in order to address many of these issues.
Great, thank you both. I'm going to shift gears again because we saw in the film, and we've certainly been seeing it in Canada, that oftentimes Indigenous people and their cultures that are thousands of years old are affected more than the rest of us who may live in cities or not in the immediate vicinity of the dam. But how does dam construction affect Indigenous cultures and people and their livelihoods? Maybe we can go to Sarah first. You've spoken with Indigenous people. Could you provide us with some firsthand accounts of what you've learned in terms of how they've experienced dams and the impact on their culture?
Yes, and so again, in Canada, dams are mostly impact Indigenous people, and I think there's a case to be made for environmental racism, where the benefits are felt in places far away and the impacts are suffered by Indigenous communities. So in the case of Treaty 8, again, the case with which I'm most familiar, the area of the Peace River that the Site C dam will flood, and that's about 128 kilometers, including the tributaries of the river that would be flooded. It's the last tract of the Peace River Valley that is available for practicing, for traditional practices like hunting and fishing and trapping. They're cultural sites. It's a low-lying, rare, low-elevation northern valley, and long time transportation route, even, transportation of great human migrations. It's rich in culture and history, and people are deeply connected to the land. So, and then if you look at northern Manitoba, where there's another large dam under construction, the Kias Dam, that is having absolutely horrendous impacts on Cree people. The stories, I went to a hydro conference just before, a couple months before COVID struck. And the stories were absolutely heartbreaking from northern Manitoba about the impacts, not just of the dam itself on fish, in this case on breeding grounds for sturgeon, and on other on the different nations, but on the impact of bringing these large, what are called here, man camps to a remote area, and the impact that has on women and girls, and on drugs coming into the community and that sort of thing. I mean, the impacts are just layer upon layer upon layer. And then if we go over to the Muskrat Falls Dam in Labrador, being built by the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, a huge boondoggle. That's what the head of the Crown Corporation that was building the dam called it, a boondoggle. Also enormously over budget, also enormously behind schedule, devastating impacts on the Inuit and Innu people, going to poison fish with methyl mercury that northern communities far away from grocery stores where they can buy reasonably priced food, rely on. It just has layer after layer after layer of impacts. And not to mention that, again, the ties to the land, the cultural history, the landmarks, the stories that emerge, the languages that come from the land, all of that is just wiped out.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And Jeff, I wonder if you can tell us about the communities that you've worked with and how they're impacted by dams, before the removal process.
Sure. My connection is really with the Elwha, and the lower Elwha-Clallam tribe has a very deep spiritual, cultural, and economic connection to the Elwha River and the lands that surround it. And they were devastated by the loss of opportunities, not only for fishing because of the dams, but there was also, treaty rights issues that were not being met for decades by the tribe. And so a very significant and devastating impact of the dams and the cultural, milieu that the tribe found themselves in for many decades, and trying to maintain their spiritual connection, subsistence harvest of salmon and other wildlife in the Elwha area, and the usual and custom areas where they have been operating for centuries. And so that was a significant effect. And also specifically the creation site for the lower Elwha-Clallam people was inundated behind the Elwha Dam, the lower of the two dams. Significant impact on the people. And when dam removal occurred, that was, I think, one of the first and most important elements is the restoration of that creation site for the lower Elwha-Clallam people. And a number of tribal elders have spoken about that and the importance of it. One thing that is not discussed in the film or a lot of the presentations that you see about the Elwha is that there's a fishing moratorium that's been in place since the start of dam removal. So pretty much all commercial and recreational fishing has stopped on the Elwha to give the river and the fish the best chance possible to recover. And so the Elwha tribe has shown great amount of patience to get through this project, to get through the dam removal, to allow the fish to begin to recover, so that they want to fish. I mean, it's a huge part of their culture and the economics of their tribe. And so we're hoping that one day, sooner rather than later, that can return, because it's a really huge element for the tribe that's currently missing.
Thank you both. It's really striking the similarities in terms of how Indigenous people in particular have been affected by dams and continue to be affected by dams. So this documentary is one example of hearing multiple voices from Indigenous people. But I wonder if you can tell us other ways that Indigenous groups from across Canada and across the U.S. can actually connect with each other to share their stories and feel like they're not alone in some of these negotiations that they're going through.
Well, I've met folks from all over the world that have come and received inspiration from the Elwha and the Elwha tribe, and look to them for leadership and to get inspiration for their story, and to try to take the lessons that have been learned in the Elwha, kind of the tribe working hand in hand with other non-governmental organizations and the federal government to get this project completed. And so, the lessons learned from the tribe, they've done a good job of reaching out to other folks. A good example is the Klamath River, which is on the border of Oregon and California. The Yurok tribe and another tribe is super involved with the upcoming dam removal of 4 dams, one of the largest dam removal projects that will have occurred once that project gets underway, hopefully in the next couple of years. There's still, it's a long process. It's complicated. There's a lot of different kind of things to have to maneuver and navigate. But we've gone down to the Klamath, and from the scientific perspective, tried to share lessons learned and what the kind of programs that we put in place to monitor the outcomes of dam removal on the Elwha, using multiple scientific lenses in order to track the trajectory of the ecosystem as it kind of responds to dam removal. And each dam removal is somewhat unique. The factors that are at play can be considerable amount of variability. And so, it's not a one size kind of fits all kind of solution, and things, can vary quite a bit from place to place. But I think that the example of the Elwha River and how the tribe was an instrumental player in that was something that's traveled kind of far and wide and is used as an inspiration in other places throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We've put a lot of trust in construction of these projects, and even the removal projects. But sometimes things don't go as planned. We saw in the film some examples of dam failures with catastrophic consequences. And Sarah, you wrote about the lack of transparency in safety and cost of the Site C dam on the piece. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about that, about the lack of transparency and the lack of sort of apparent safety in the process.
Sure. So this has been a project that's just been plagued by a lack of due process from the get-go. It's been very hard to get information about it. Much of the information that we have has been through Freedom of Information requests that take a long time to get, and that you have to duke it out to actually get back something that's not redacted. I once got back 800 redacted pages within a larger request. And so it begs the question, and this is, I'm repeating what people who will be directly impacted by the dam have said. Well, if everything is so above board, then why all the secrecy? Why is this so secret? No private corporation would get away with this type of environmental impact, with this type of secrecy. Why we as ratepayers in the province are paying for the project? Why don't we have this information? We have a situation where there's no bid contracts being given out by unknown people at BC Hydro that total millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. We have some of these contracts going to numbered companies. I tracked down one of the numbered companies, and it turned out that it was registered to executives of a company that had just gone bankrupt and had been dismissed from the Site C Civil Works Consortium. There's a lot that is not in the open. And people think of Canada as a great democracy and a country with a lot of transparency. In fact, it is very hard as a journalist to get information, and we have a marked lack of transparency when it comes to publicly funded projects. And again, this is public money. The public should have a right to know how the money is being spent, who is profiting from the project, and who is giving out these direct award contracts, that sort of thing. And so one of the things that's emerged was that the government was sitting on information about the geotechnical problems, and some of the more minor geotechnical problems, and this is related to the fact that it's being built on shale. The dam's not being constructed in your typical rock canyon. It emerged, a couple of years ago, but the big problems emerged well before the public was informed about them. And at every step of the way, there's been an opportunity to walk away from this project, but because in part of the delays in the public having information, the public just doesn't have this information. We've had 2 elections since the project was started. And the public did not have access to this information in a timely manner. And so when the public does have access to this type of information, it champions much better, I think, more democratic decision making.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, dams have been, a huge help in some respects with, delivering water, providing irrigation, preventing flooding to a certain extent. And they provide about 20% of global electricity. Is there a way that we can meet these benefits in a sustainable way for the health, while protecting the health of our environment and the justice of communities and stakeholders?
I think that back in the day when during that kind of heyday of dam building that I talked about earlier, the ecological kind of effects of dams was not considered very often in terms of the trade-offs that are at play. But that has changed considerably, and I think that a lot of the innovation and other kind of elements of trying to figure out a way to kind of have our cake and eat it too, harnessing renewable energy from rivers while minimizing the effects of dams is something that is an attainable goal that people are trying to work towards and to innovate. That's really what it's going to take. But there's a lot of work to be done. But I think that there's a considerable amount of people that are working on that, redesigning modular hydro, redesigning turbine structures, trying to figure out ways to have a dam on a river, but not totally block the river. Things like that. Pump storage was talked about earlier as a potential to increase the amount of hydroelectric electricity generation. And so, I think that it's going to take a significant amount of investment and innovation and smart people thinking about how to solve these problems to get hopefully the best of both worlds.
Yeah. So another question I've wondered about is, we have a lot of dams in North America, a lot around the world, tens of thousands in North America. And in particular, if you add the small dams, it's even more than that. Is there anybody who's thinking about the long-term liability of these structures for the taxpayer, for the safety of our populations? I mean, I think over the next 100 to 150 years, we're going to have very big decisions to make about whether to keep some of the dams and which ones to remove. And how are we going to cover the cost of refurbishment for the ones that we decide to keep, or deconstruction for the ones that we decide we need to remove?
That's a very interesting point. And so here, we don't include deconstruction or remediation costs in the price tag for these dams. And again, we're behind the states and we haven't really had to deal with a large dam removal that I'm aware of anyway in Canada. But I think it all goes back to the election cycle, and here we have pretty much 4-year election cycles, and we can't seem to think beyond that, and we are certainly not thinking about what happens in 60 years or 80 years or 100 years or more than 100 years, and who's going to pay for the decommissioning or the refurbishment of dams. And again, it's just going to get more and more expensive when you look at the cost of building a new one. And so we do need to be more creative. I know that there's, everything from more efficient turbines installed in existing dams to looking very carefully at which dams should stay and which ones should go, and how we can better balance energy needs. And I think that what people are up against is this whole notion, and it's really a branding notion, that just because something is hydropower, that it's clean and green. And I think we need to look at the hydro industry as we look at any other industry, the mining industry, the oil industry. There is a big hydro industry out there. There are a lot of companies that make a lot of money from this industry. And as environmental concerns have come more to the forefront, there's an entire industry that exists to, and I put this in quotations, to mitigate the impacts of some of these dams through building fish ladders, or again, in the case of Site C, an absolutely mind-boggling scheme where they're going to try to get bull trout to go up fish ladders, and because the Site C dam will block their access to their spawning grounds, and basically anesthetize them and truck them past the dam for its lifespan, which could be anywhere from 70 to 100 years. So we're going to be paying for this to happen. And again, these mitigation schemes, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but there's some of them are really not grounded in science. Like, for example, salmon will use fish ladders, but there's no evidence that bull trout will.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really great point, Sarah. I wouldn't mind asking Jeff about fish ladders, because we often hear proposals, oh, well, don't worry, we'll put in a fish ladder. But do they work? And when do they work, and when do they not work?
I think a lot of it depends on what the site conditions are of that particular location. It depends on how big the dam is that they have to get past is a big kind of element of that question. I think in some cases they've been shown to work, and in other cases it's not so much. And so there's a considerable amount of, I think, research that's going on right now to try to address that question. How do you could build a great fish bypass structure, but it's attracting the fish to that structure can be a real big challenge. And so a lot of work has gone into trying to figure that out. And in some cases, they have fish elevators where they take the adult fish, get them up the dam. You may have heard of the salmon cannon, the whoosh system, that basically is a way to transport the individual fish through a tube to get them upstream of the dam. That's only half of the equation, of course. Once the fish, make it up past the dam to their spawning grounds and they spawn, then you've got the juveniles that need to migrate, downstream. And so then they have to be collected in a way. You have to track the juvenile fish to the collector to get them safely past the dam, so that they don't go through the turbines or down the spillway. Because in many cases, if they do, they can be harmed considerably by passing through the turbines, or there's a nitrogen gas kind of syndrome that happens just downstream of dams that can be significant fish health issue. And so there's a lot of kind of moving parts with moving fish around dams. But it's as Sarah mentioned, it's a significant kind of industry that is looking at trying to mitigate those kinds of things and effects, to try to have a dam be in place and still have salmon be part of the river system. And there's a number of examples in Washington where they're looking to where areas that currently have a dam to reintroduce salmon upstream of the dam, and to put in these technological ways to transport fish around the dam. And I think the jury is kind of still out in terms of the effectiveness of that and the best practices that are associated with it. But as I said, there's a considerable amount of research that's currently underway to address those questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So as we saw in Damnation, there's a huge power to storytelling and telling stories about water, what rivers look like before dams. But we also want to think about what should it look like in the future, or what could it look like in the future? do you think there's a power or a place in using these stories to enact the change that we want to see? Maybe we'll go to Sarah first.
Absolutely, and this goes back to a previous question about organizations. And so here in Canada, we have an organization called Waniskatan, which is an alliance of hydro-impacted communities. And Waniskatan means wake up or rise up in Cree. And it's the organization has offices at the University of Manitoba and is closely connected to the communities in northern Manitoba who will be greatly impacted by the Keeyask Dam. So there's absolutely a power in storytelling, and I think that, again, like, part of the issue here is that in Canada anyway, that these dams are built in places usually very far away from where most people live, and there's a great kind of northern-southern divide, and it's very hard. I mean, we just don't here in the South read about what happens in the north of our provinces very often at all. We just don't hear about it, and so it's just essential to get these stories out, and to for the members of organizations like Waniskatan to have a voice and to tell their stories.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to say there's just a note about questions from the audience here.
Yeah, I'm looking for the questions. I don't see any written yet, but we would like to open it up to the audience. So if you want to type into the chat, we would love to take some questions from the audience.
Looks like there's a question on Scream about how will taking out dams affect the water supply and forecasted drought brought on by climate change. Yeah, that's a great question. Water storage, water supply, irrigation, all of those kind of capacities for dams are super important, and it's something that is a big issue, and it gets back to this whole notion of trade-offs and what in terms of what we value. And a lot of times the values are conflicting with one another, whether or not you want to have fish or irrigation water. And so that's a tough issue. I think it varies considerably depending on where you're at in the world and what the local stakeholders and what the local kind of conditions are. And it's something that we're going to be faced with, though, I think increasingly as time goes on. And so that's a tough, hard, but important question to work on, to understand how water shortage is going to be continuing to impact places that are arid. We're in a considerable drought here in the western United States right now. A lot of reservoirs throughout the West are down in terms of their capacity, and so a lot of the dams, there's about 1,800 dams that have been removed so far in the United States. The vast majority of them are smaller structures, less than 3 meters in height. Very few of them are water storage dams. Very few of them are hydroelectric dams. A lot of them were built in an era where their function is suited for a bygone era, mill dams and other dams. These dams that currently have important modern function and are still functioning that way are the really tough ones to deal with and to figure out the best solutions. And it's something that is a real challenge, and something I think we're going to be faced with more and more in the future because of the reasons that we've been talking about today and in the movie.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So the next question, will the transition to adopting electrical vehicles and the insanity of cryptocurrency mining power needs not necessitate more electrical power grid infrastructure, unfortunately including hydro dams? So basically the question is asking, will we, given that there's going to be such a huge increase in energy demand, probably not just with cryptocurrency, but also with generally with now I've lost my train of thought. With not only Bitcoin mining, but with crypto communications, which is coming as well, there's going to be huge energy demand. So what are our options?
We hear a lot here that we need more hydro to deal with the electrification of our provinces and territories. But I haven't seen that the numbers add up so far. Again, I just point to energy conservation as the first thing that needs to happen with big investments in energy conservation. And I don't have numbers in front of me that say, well, this will save X amount of electricity. But I do know that the former CEO of BC Hydro announced that the energy conservation measures that we had here in BC before the budget was slashed would have had saved as much electricity as Site C would produce. So I just hold that up as one small example. I mean, obviously, electrification is very important to deal with climate change. It's just how we deal with that. And definitely the first place to start is with energy conservation.
Well, I just have one quick question for Jeff, and then we'll start to wrap up. Jeff, in the film, it was really interesting to see the perspective presented on fish hatcheries and how in some cases they might actually have a detrimental impact. And I wonder if fish hatcheries do play any kind of a role in recovery for wild fish, or whether it's best just to leave it to nature.
Another super important, controversial question. There's a lot of science that's been coming out recently to show that there's a difference between hatchery and wild fish, and it can be heritable. There can be epigenetic effects. At the same time, we see due to the loss of habitat and other kind of environmental impacts on salmon habitat, we see harvest. A lot of people really like to consume salmon. In some cases, it's a matter of subsistence. In other cases, it's an economic thing. It's a huge industry, billions of dollars for both commercial and recreational fishing. And so, it's the classic 4-H kind of problem of salmon. There's habitat, hatcheries, harvest, and hydropower. And hatcheries, and it was discussed in the movie, have been kind of propped up as a potential solution to make up for that foregone loss of salmon production because of the other 3 H's. And so, that's a big issue. But I think as we've kind of become more evolved in our understanding of what the effects are of hatcheries, can be significant differences between wild and hatchery fish. A lot of it is early part of the life cycle of salmon. They're receiving 3 square meals a day that just magically kind of appear. The behavior has been shown, to change. They're more keyed into what's going on up above them. Just kind of as an example, there's other kind of heritable kind of changes that can occur, which would be fine if the hatcheries were operating in a bubble. But often you get spillover and you get hatchery fish mating with wild fish. And there's concern that then can reduce the fitness of wild fish. There's been a considerable work done to try to revise hatchery practices to try to minimize those impacts. In some cases, there's been calls for kind of hatchery-free or wild sanctuary watersheds in places that you're not going to eliminate hatcheries everywhere probably, but are there certain areas that we can focus on to really have wild fish be the key of conservation strategy? But it's a real big, very controversial issue, and one that is kind of evolving kind of over time. And it's very much related to these other wider societal issues that we've been discussing here and that were presented in the movie. I seem to have lost you, Graham. I don't know if you're on mute there.
We didn't hear what you just said, Graham.
We've lost your audio, Graham.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to go to one more question from the audience, if we could. Who do we talk to enact change? We'll go to Sarah first.
Well, I think it depends where you live And that's a very interesting question that wraps together so much of what we've talked about today. I think elected representatives are a good place to go to start. And in Canada, our hydro corporations, and they are mostly hydro corporations, not power corporations. And so, yeah, but I think it's most important to go to the communities that are impacted by these projects and to hear their stories and to give them voice outside of their communities into not just other parts of Canada, but with the power, more and more of our power going to the States, but in the States as well. And it strikes me as a little bit ironic that the US is decommissioning dams to protect fish, and yet is poised to import power from new hydro dams in Canada, which will have absolutely devastating impacts on all kinds of fish, from bull trout to brook trout to sturgeon.
Well, Sarah and Jeff, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I thank you so much for your time this afternoon. For the folks in the audience, if you're interested in any of our guest books or articles, they can be found on our webpage. This panel discussion will also be available on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and our Let's Talk About Water podcast. As we've done each month this year as part of our 2021 Let's Talk About Water Film Festival, we have 3 new films available for you to watch for free now through June 17th. The featured films are Damnation, which was inspired for this forum and the conversation today. Dot TV, a short film with found footage exploring sea level rise in Tuvalu. And Beasts of the Southern Wild, a 4-time Academy Award nominee about extreme flooding events in the southeastern United States. So please visit www.letstalkaboutwater.ca to watch these films for free. Follow us on social media and stay tuned for the announcement of our 2021 Water Film Prize winner, June 21st to 25th. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Graham, Sarah. It's nice
Thank
meeting
you.
you, and thank you to all the viewers out there. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for joining us today.